promised probably months ago now that we would in fact look at these very controversial passages where Paul talks about women in the church. And that day has come. I can avoid it no longer. There have been countless volumes written on this topic. And I cannot possibly unpack all of the facets and all of the arguments for you this morning. And because so much has been written, in a lot of ways, I really hesitate to add to that, to put my own 2 cents in here. But for every congregation of the Lord's church, what Paul has to say about women and its ramifications, how we apply that, has significant impact on how we function as a fellowship. And so it ends up being a topic that we can't avoid forever. We really have to deal with it. We really have to come to terms with it. It's of functional importance for us at the local church level. There are lots of problems with this study, problems even as I have engaged this study. I acknowledge there's a certain amount of confirmation bias. That is, we begin with the end in mind. We already have an idea of what we think the scriptures say, or what we think the scriptures ought to say, what we would like them to say, and then we go looking for validation for that point of view. That's always a danger. And so if you're steeply rooted in the traditional interpretation that the church has often offered for these passages, there's a certain amount of bias in that, and we may or may not recognize that we have that bias. If you have absorbed sort of all the cultural expectations that the culture has about women and the roles that women will play, then you have that bias, and you may or may not recognize that bias as you study these passages. I feel like I'm very much on a steady path here to satisfying absolutely no one. If you're in a really traditional camp, you're probably not going to be real thrilled with what I have to say, and if you're in a real progressive camp, probably not real thrilled with me either. Hopefully we're going to be true to Scripture, and that's my goal. Recognizing that I too have biases that I don't always recognize. We're going to make our best effort here to be true to the Word. And in terms of the Word, there are 2 very difficult passages that have comprised the sort of ground zero for this debate about women in the church. And that debate has been characterized, particularly in the last recent decades of the church, between these 2 sort of positions, complementarian and egalitarian, we call them. These are imperfect categories, but the complementarian view is basically that men and women are equal in the sight of God, but that they sometimes have different roles or different functions. And the egalitarian view is essentially that men and women are equal, and that specifically in the Christian era, any differences in role or function are meant to be erased. That's part of the hope of the gospel. Now, I am vastly oversimplifying these 2 positions, and of course, there are a wide range of variations within each one, and probably nobody in either camp would be particularly thrilled with the way that I have described them. On the other hand, oversimplification seems somehow appropriate when we're talking about this debate, because most of the arguments that you will hear have in fact been oversimplified in one fashion or another. I mentioned 2 difficult passages, one in 1 Corinthians and one in 1 Timothy. 1 Corinthians, we're just going to read through them. 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35 says, "Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Nothing controversial there. 1 Timothy 2, starting with verse 11, says, "A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first and then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety." Now, obviously, these passages have been very much debated. They have been interpreted in wildly different ways. It is a struggle for us to understand the full context of these passages and to understand the conversation that's taking place, particularly in Corinthians, where the Corinthian letter is widely regarded to be an answer to questions that are being raised, and so we only have half of that conversation. There are very few, I think, honest theologians who claim to have absolute confidence in their view of these passages. In fact, I'm rather suspicious of anybody who has absolute confidence in their understanding of these passages. I think that maybe is the way that we would like to feel about them, but most of us don't feel that way about them. All we can really do is offer our best understanding to date. And that's what I'm going to attempt to do this morning, is offer you my best understanding to date. But first, we've got to dive into why these passages are confusing, why they are difficult. Of course, there are some who don't regard them as difficult at all. And they would say that a simple reading of Paul's words yields a simple solution. In other words, Paul means precisely what it sounds like he means. We might call this the strict complementarian view. And most of my young life in the church, I was taught this very simple and often very literal interpretation of these passages. And it mostly applied to women in public worship, but it also applied in a variety of other contexts, such that women could not teach, they could not speak, they could not pray, they could not read, they could not lead worship music, for instance. They couldn't even pass the communion tray around because we felt like this was in violation of this simple principle, which we were really trying to be faithful to the Word. And when we read these passages just in their simple form, it does very much sound like Paul is trying to prohibit women from participation in an awful lot. There are a number of problems with that simple reading of the passage, though. For one, Jesus and Paul are both far more egalitarian in practice than a simple reading would suggest. Jesus converses with women all the time, which is really pretty revolutionary and scandalous. He teaches them, he has women disciples, he travels with them, he has women patrons. He even asks women to be witnesses of his resurrection to his disciples. Paul really sort of picks up on that theme. He commends various women as co-workers. He speaks of Junius as being well regarded among the apostles, and this debate there is whether Junius is a woman who is fulfilling the apostolic commission as a messenger, or if she's just well regarded, well thought of among those who are. He talks about Priscilla, who with her husband Aquila is doing some teaching, specifically of Apollos, and correcting some bad theology that he has. He talks about Timothy's mother and grandmother being instrumental in bringing Timothy to faith. Basically relies on women as messengers, as disciples of Jesus. He talks about women who host churches in their homes. And so when we have this very simple, very literal reading of these difficult passages, then there is a sort of dissonance. Like, what do we do with this dissonance? Here's Paul describing these women doing these various things in the early church in a very favorable light, and then he has this admonition that they be silent in the churches. Plus which, Paul's own words sort of demonstrate that whatever prescription he's making here is limited. In 1 Corinthians 11, he talks about women praying and prophesying in the church. In chapter 14, he talks about how each one brings something to the assembly to share with all of the others. So when we lift this passage out of its context and read it by itself, then a simple reading gives us a simple answer. When we read it in its context, it becomes more complicated. But also, if we take this to its logical extreme, a simple reading a lot of times sort of becomes absurd. John Mark Hicks, who is a professor of theology at Lipscomb University, relates this story of when one of his young daughters was in a Christian training program. You know, these training programs for children and teach them how to lead prayers and lead songs in church. And she was in a particular group that was making a little argument. She's going to give a little presentation about some Bible topic. And so John goes to the room where she's going to be participating in this group, and she's going to be making her presentation, and he finds himself barred from attendance. He's not allowed to enter the room. And he says, well, why not? And they quote to him from 1 Timothy 2. So then, basically the notion here is they're afraid that John Mark Hicks, professor of theology at Lipscomb University, might enter the room where his adolescent child is talking Bible, and he might accidentally learn something from his daughter. You see how the application can become absurd at some point. And there are all of these questions. We used to debate at what point can women no longer teach our Bible classes because the boys are getting too old? At what point does Timothy's mother and grandmother need to stop offering him wisdom and counsel? Can I talk about upcoming lessons, things that I'm thinking about, things that I'm studying? Can I talk about that with my wife, or am I in danger of learning something from what she will say? Most of us do not apply these principles absolutely. We recognize that there is some limitation at work. A couple of the best books that I've read in the last year were written by women. Actually, an incredibly terrific book that I read this last year, ironically, is a defense of biblical masculinity that was written by a woman. Now, is she wrong to write that book knowing that I'll come along and read it and learn something from her? Some people say, well, this is just limited to the assembly, which itself raises some questions. Why is a woman's voice, why is her teaching, why is her authority somehow toxic in the assembly and not elsewhere? And if it's not a problem elsewhere, then how did it become a problem in the assembly? And of course, we also have to recognize that this idea of the church, or really the assembly is a more appropriate interpretation of that. This idea of the assembly, we think of it maybe like this. I mean, our numbers are a little low this morning, and we think of ourselves as a small church already. But in terms of the early church, this is not a small church because they're meeting in homes. Imagine shoving all these people into your living room and you get some sense of why they wouldn't consider this a small church. So the gatherings that we're talking about are less institutional than we imagine and often far more intimate. And so these prohibitions seem problematic. One of the things I've had to learn over the years, and kids, you want to get this, the Bible does not make rules for the sake of making rules. There are a lot of times that we don't understand why God commands a thing. There's a lot of times we don't understand the principle behind it. We don't understand that there is purpose and order and wisdom, but we can at least understand that there is, in fact, purpose and order and wisdom, and that we are welcome to go looking for it. So we arrive at this point where the apparent contradiction in Paul's words and actions requires a resolution. And this is where we get sort of the other end of the spectrum. If we think about a strict egalitarian view, that view often seeks to edit these passages completely out of the Scriptures. John Stott put it this way. He says, they declare Paul's teaching to be inapplicable on one or other of four grounds, namely that it is mistaken, it is confusing, it is culture-bound, or it is purely situational. And since Stott wrote these words, I would add there's an argument that these words have been inserted after the fact, and there's an argument that these words lack sort of the grammatical context that we need to understand them properly. And there are problems. There are always interpretive problems and translation problems. Particularly when we look at the letter to the Corinthians, as I said, we're only getting half of a conversation, and so that makes Corinthians difficult at times. But also, it's widely believed that what we regard as 1 Corinthians is actually 2 Corinthians, that the first letter to the Corinthians is lost to us. And so we're really sort of coming in the very middle of an ongoing conversation. And so there's some problems related to that, and so some challenges that are very real. In this passage, this controversial passage in Corinthians, in some of the manuscripts that we have, it changes position. It's at a different position on the page. And this has raised speculation that maybe this passage was not even in the original manuscript, that it was sort of a side note that eventually got incorporated into the text. Problem is, we don't have any manuscripts that don't have this passage in it. So sometimes we can go back to an earlier manuscript and find that, yes, this phrase was added from somewhere else, but we don't have evidence, clear evidence of that on this point. And here's kind of some of the problems that I have with the way that strict egalitarianism has approached the issue. First off, let me just say that speculative editing sets a very bad precedent. So good Bible study is hard work. We have a 2,000-year-old text that's been filtered through languages, it's been filtered through culture. Understanding the context of a passage, the tone, the audience of that passage, all this is incredibly important. And we're trying to discern the original intent of the author. I think we have to exercise caution when somebody starts editing things out of the text or redefining them in order to suit their particular biases. When I was a young man in the 80s and 90s, there was this thing called the Jesus Seminar. Some of you might remember the Jesus Seminar. It was prominently featured in the media a lot. And the Jesus Seminar was basically a collection of Bible scholars, just being generous, who would get together and would have they'd have these meetings, and they had this whole system of voting. They had different beads for different things, and you would vote with these beads. And basically what they would do is they would get together, they would read through the Gospels, and then they would all collectively vote on whether what the passage just said is something that actually happened or was added later by some of Jesus' followers. Did Jesus actually say that, or did he not say that? And so sort of going through and sort of selectively editing the Gospels for us. The media loved the Jesus Seminar. And there would be some finding that the Jesus Seminar came to, and it would be reported in the media, or it would make it into Time magazine. And why? Well, because they were these outlier, incredibly liberal scholars. And so they would undermine things in the text, and the media loved it. They ate it up, and they would report on it as if this was like a decision made by the highest authorities in Christianity. It really is kind of an outlier group, if anything. I've become very suspicious of that, very concerned about that. And I think as a culture, we've reached a place where that sort of instinctual wisdom is really commonplace, where we kind of invite people to read through the Bible and go, well, does that feel right to you? If it doesn't feel right to you, just edit it out. And that works, I think, because at present in Christian culture, we're not concerned enough about the threat of bad theology to take the time to learn good theology. And we've got to do something about that. But there's a bigger problem at work here, and that is that Paul's instruction is actually pretty consistent. We're talking about headship and authority and submission. We're not talking about one aberrant passage where Paul says something that's way out in left field. This is a theme that he has woven through several letters over many years of ministry. Now, it's always possible that we have taken that theme and we have confused its meaning, or we have misused those passages, and we may be frustrated by the content, but complete dismissal is not really an option. We can't just edit it clean out of there. And then we have the problem that Paul roots his argument in creation. It's an indication that we're referring here to God's intended order. Now, that's still confusing. It's not abundantly clear what that order is that Paul is drawing from that. And then there's this phrase he uses in the Corinthian letter. He says, as the law also says. But your women are going to be silent, they're going to be submissive, as the law also says. A lot of debate about that phrase, because it's like, well, what law? What law are we talking about? Generally, we've agreed that it's not a law about silence, because we can't find anything in the law about women being silent per se. So it's probably about submission. But where? What law are we referring to? Often it is, unfortunately, conflated with the curse. So sort of the standard teaching has been that what Paul is referring to here is the curse in Genesis 3, where it says, to the woman, her desire will be for her husband, and he will rule over you. And I say that's unfortunate because the curse is a curse. It's not meant to be policy. I'm really fascinated by this tendency that we have to think that when we face the consequences of our own sin, that God needs us to help other people face those consequences. We're going to make sure that this happens. He also says, I'm going to amplify your pain in childbirth. We don't feel the need to amplify a woman's pain in childbirth. I don't think it should be rooted in the curse, and I don't think that's what Paul is talking about. But what law? In all honesty, we don't know. Submission, a policy of submission is more likely than a policy of silence, but it's all rooted back for Paul in the creation. And so this echoes back to chapter 11, where he talks about this discourse that we studied on headship. There is something ordered in the creation that gives credence to this idea of headship, and Paul wants us to root this little bit of theology in that. All right, so kids, here's another little principle to work from. Just try to read the Bible honestly. Try to read the Bible honestly. And it is harder than you think, because we bring our biases to it. There's what we're comfortable with and what we're not comfortable with. And we live in a culture that's all about self-reference. It's all about how do I feel? And if I feel good about that, then it applies. And if I don't feel good about that, then it doesn't. Makes honest Bible study difficult. But there's some things in these passages that we hopefully can all acknowledge. Number one is that there is a prohibition. Paul means to limit something. I think it's problematic anytime somebody just tries to argue that there's no prohibition here. There's something going on, and Paul wants to put some limits on it. But there's still lots of questions, right? There's questions about when he talks to women. That term in the Greek can apply to women or wives. So in what instance is he talking to women in general, and what instance is he specifically talking to wives? And silence. The Greek term here that we translate silence can also mean a quietness or quietness of spirit. So which is the better interpretation for this particular passage? And even the assembly. I have some questions about the assembly, the ecclesia. To what are we referring? Because ecclesia is not a specifically spiritual or religious term. It is a cultural term that eventually becomes applied to the Christian believers and that we now translate usually as the church. The ecclesia is a gathering, it's an assembly, and these gatherings have different purposes. So we are in an assembly this morning that has a purpose. Tomorrow night, your ministers and elders will meet in an assembly. We will also call that the church. So what kind of assembly are we talking about? And what do we mean when we say teach? And what does it mean to assume authority? They're all good questions. I hope we can all agree that it is not universal. There is a prohibition, but it is not universal. Particularly in the letter to the Corinthians, Paul has already enumerated the participation of women in public worship. And moreover, the role of women in the church is part of this promised covenant that everybody's looking forward to. So when Peter preaches that first sermon on Pentecost after the arrival of the Holy Spirit, he offers the crowd this explanation. In the last days, God says, this is from the prophet Joel, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I've made this distinction before, but I think it's important here. Prophecy does not necessarily mean telling the future. What the prophets did, future telling is really a relatively small part of what the prophets do. Prophecy means speaking the truth of God boldly. If we pour out God's Spirit on women to speak the truth of God boldly, then under what circumstances would we limit that and why? And so hopefully we can agree that there is a specificity which makes the prohibition appropriate. If it's not universal, then how and when does it apply? And the frustrating thing is, it appears in the passages that Paul just sort of assumes that we already can tell the difference. One common assertion is that maybe this has to do with the ignorance of uneducated women. Because women did not generally receive any formal education in either of these cultures, in Hebrew or Roman culture. And there's some merit to that. And when we read in Timothy where he says it wasn't the man who was deceived, but the woman who was deceived, we have often read that to mean that somehow it is her ignorance or some kind of weakness in her character that makes her problematic. When we arrive at this conclusion, though, we have a distinct problem, which is that an awful lot of the men, in terms of Christian doctrine, awful lot of the men are ignorant as well. So why we would have a prohibition against women speaking out of ignorance and not men is, well, it's questionable. I think we can say that the specificity is a function of divine order. In both of these letters, Paul recounts the order of creation. He talks about the man being created first. And what does that mean? So we go back to 1 Corinthians 11, 8 and 9. He says, "For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man," which makes it all clear as mud. You're all good now. Now, whatever Paul prohibits here, whatever circumstance that prohibition applies, is rooted in a principle that Paul sees played out in the creation. There's another important element for us to acknowledge that comes out in the letter to Timothy. It is imperative that women learn. It says a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I think a lot of times because these passages are controversial, because they've been debated for so long, sometimes when we read that statement, we are distracted from the most extraordinary thing in that statement, and we get focused on the derivative things. The extraordinary thing in that statement is he says women should learn. Because in both Roman and Jewish culture, women were rarely educated beyond what they would need in order to run a household. It was considered largely a waste of time to educate women. In rabbinical tradition, and I want to be real clear here, we're not talking about the law of Moses, because the law of Moses is actually quite favorable to women. But in rabbinical tradition, women were considered often irrelevant to God's work. Teaching them was regarded as futile. In fact, there are a few rabbis who regard teaching Torah to women as an abomination. Jesus comes along and treats women with unprecedented dignity. He has conversations with them that surprise even his followers. He teaches women. All of this is, I don't know if I can impress upon you how revolutionary and really downright scandalous this is at times, what Jesus does in the way that he treats women in his public ministry. And Paul really picks up on that. And here he says that women should learn. And I think this reference to Eve is not a reference to her inherent weakness. I think Paul is saying women should learn because you don't want them to be deceived the way that Eve was. Don't leave them in ignorance because that makes them vulnerable to false teachers. And then there's that crazy passage at the end where he says she'll be saved through childbirth, which sounds like women are supposed to stay barefoot and pregnant in order to be saved. Which is not at all, I think, what Paul's after. I think basically some of your translations, it probably says women will be saved. In the original Greek, it's she. She will be saved. I think what he's saying, and this is rather poetic interpretation, but it's really quite beautiful when you think about it. I think what he's saying is that Eve will be saved as the progenitor of the Messiah if you, as the recipients of that salvation, continue in the pathway. But there exists, in the midst of this remarkable, revolutionary opportunity for women in the church, there exists some authority that she may not overrule. Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority or sometimes usurp authority over a man. The Greek there is authenteo. It means to act on one's own authority, to dominate. It can even be translated as murder. So it's a very sort of aggressive takeover, if you will. So what are we saying? Women are joint heirs of the kingdom of Christ. They are recipients of the Holy Spirit. They are disciples of Jesus. We are to welcome their gifts and their service and their participation in fellowship. But there is a limitation, and the limitation is that they not use this newfound freedom to reject the authority of headship. And the authority implied in these passages is that of her husband and her elders. And in the Corinthian letter is fairly specific. It says, let her ask her husband at home, which implies that what we're talking about here is a wife who is submitting herself to the headship of her husband. In Timothy, he used the words teach or exercise authority, which I'm fairly certain is a reference to what he's going to talk about in the next chapter, where he talks about the work of elders. So here's my best understanding. My best understanding to date. Free women to use their gifts, to practice discipleship, to pray, to prophesy, yes, even to teach and to lead, with this proviso: they must continue to respect and submit to headship. As we all submit to the headship of Christ, a wife will submit to the headship of her husband as the head of her household, and she will submit as a member of the church to the elders as the head of the household of the church, along, incidentally, with all the men who are themselves not elders of the church. Then we come back to the question of why. Why is this in here? Why is this limitation necessary? And I want to draw an observation here. When we vacate the principle of headship, we relieve men of a primary spiritual responsibility to which they are called. I'm going to tell you right now, it is a responsibility that we as men are already inclined, because of our sinful nature, to neglect. We don't need to invite men to not assume spiritual responsibility. They're somewhat likely to do that on their own. And so when Paul makes this argument from creation, it's often been dismissed as sort of primogeniture, which is this idea that because the man is created first, he's sort of the firstborn of creation and therefore the inheritor of everything. And it's kind of borrowed from this idea of the firstborn in a family. And so you kind of have this picture then of like twins being born, and one is born 5 minutes before the other and holds it over his sibling's head for the rest of their life. I'm the older one, I'm in charge. I don't think that's actually what Paul's getting at here. I think he's talking about the story of creation in which the man is created and given the task of dominion in the world, and then it is recognized that he needs the perfect helper for that task. He needs his equal opposite, and the woman is introduced to him. I want you to recall that when we're talking about headship, what I have suggested to you very consistently, and I have to visit it again, because even as I say these words, you'll think, oh, he's talking about men dominating women. I have suggested to you repeatedly that headship is not about control and hierarchy, but that it is about servanthood and sacrifice. It is an assumption of spiritual responsibility. John Stott put it this way, and I didn't even know that Stott and I agreed on this, so it's kind of fun to read this. He says, headship is a liberating mix of care and responsibility rather than control and authority. It is away from questions of domination and decision making and into the sphere of service and nurture. In other words, as I have suggested to you before, God calls men to be sacrificial space makers. That's their job. That's their job in all of creation. That is their job in their household. And that is their job in the church. And as an analogy to kind of understand what I'm saying, because culturally, we can't really abide the idea that somebody has a different responsibility and is not therefore in control and just issuing orders. I like to think about it this way. Imagine we all get on a bus together. We're all going to take a trip across the country on a bus. Only one of us is the driver. And whoever sits in that driver's seat has assumed a degree of responsibility to protect everyone on that bus. Now, we don't necessarily look at the driver and say, that driver is superior to us. Neither do we look at the driver and say that driver is necessarily inferior to us. Driver is still our equal, but we defer to the driver as one who has assumed ultimate responsibility for us. So if that bus goes off the road, they won't be questioning us in the back of the bus, even if we were trying to be a backseat driver. They won't be questioning the people in the back of the bus about what happened. They'll be questioning the driver who has assumed that responsibility. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about headship. As Christ assumes responsibility sacrificially for the church, a husband assumes responsibility sacrificially for his wife. An elder assumes responsibility sacrificially for the household of the Lord's church. Scripture, I believe, calls men to this sacrificial servanthood specifically in a way that it does not call women reciprocally. But furthermore, when men fall short of this calling, the space that they are meant to create is necessarily diminished. Certainly, when men have misinterpreted these ideas and have used them to try to seek control over women, to dominate women, to be abusive towards women, they have not served the king, but they have tried to create their own kingdom. And when we try to create our own kingdom, we create a world that is very, very small. And then we're asking everyone over whom we have spiritual responsibility to dwell in our very, very small kingdom. We have diminished the space in which they operate. But also, when we're not even trying to be abusive, when we as men simply fail to observe the responsibility that we have, having been called to headship, we are inherently shrinking the space in which others are going to try to live. See, in either case, women who live in submission to that headship end up occupying a very small sphere because we haven't made space for them to live in the kingdom of God. We've shrunk space and asked them to live in the kingdom of me. And what this has meant in the church is that we have often relegated women to very, very small roles in the church, at least publicly, because we all know they're running things behind the scenes. We have relegated women to very small roles in the church publicly to make men who are not stepping up look like actual leaders. Men who have not risen to the challenge of headship, who have not assumed that spiritual responsibility for others, who have not exercised that spiritual authority and leadership, need women to be small in order to make themselves appear significant. And so they are threatened by even the most nominal displays from women because it exposes their own lack of leadership. So here's where I end on this. And we may not agree entirely. may not agree at all. But this is what I've come to at this point in my journey. The witness of Scripture affirms the full participation of women using their gifts under headship within and without the assembly to fulfill the Great Commission. And what does that mean? Well, the particulars of that, I guess we still have to work through and work out. Are there abuses? Absolutely. There are abuses of a male nature and a female nature. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. But I think the important principle here is, for me, as I understand it, the important principle is when women, as wives, operate under the headship of their husbands, and as church members operate with the rest of us under the headship of the elders, they should have enormous liberty to exercise their gifts for the good of Christ's kingdom.